I was driving through the long, desolate stretch of Highway 53, a seemingly endless road cutting through the mountains. It was past midnight, and the air had that eerie stillness you only feel in the dead of night, as if the world itself had gone to sleep. The only sounds were the soft hum of my tires against the asphalt and the occasional whisper of the wind. I had been on the road for nearly 7 hours, making my way from Salt Lake City to a small town in Idaho for a family emergency. My uncle had suffered a stroke, and I needed to be there. The last-minute trip meant I had no time to plan, no time to rest, just a frantic rush to pack and leave. The road stretched before me, empty, black, and hypnotic. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the endless rows of pines lining the highway. I was running on caffeine and sheer willpower, but the fatigue was creeping in. My eyelids grew heavier with each passing mile, my grip on the steering wheel loosening. Then I saw him, a man on the side of the highway, just standing there. His silhouette was tall and rigid, dressed in a dark suit, his hands tucked neatly into his pockets. He wasn't hitchhiking, nor did he seem lost. He was simply there, watching. As I passed, I caught a glimpse of his face, expressionless, eyes following my car. A shiver rippled down my spine, but exhaustion dulled my response. My mind was probably playing tricks on me. I exhaled sharply and kept driving. 10 minutes later, I saw him again. Same suit, same posture, same vacant expression. Only this time, he was standing on the opposite side of the road. My fingers tightened around the wheel. I checked my rearview mirror. Nothing. The highway was long, winding, and isolated. There were no side roads he could have taken to get ahead of me. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. Just drive. I pressed the gas pedal a little harder. The engine growled as I sped up, trying to shake off the unease creeping over me like a shadow. I needed to stop soon, stretch my legs, maybe splash some cold water on my face. A small rest stop appeared up ahead, a flickering neon sign marking its existence. It was the only sign of civilization I had seen in miles. I pulled in, parking under one of the dim, buzzing lights. The moment I stepped out of the car, the night felt heavier, suffocating. The wind had stopped. Even the crickets had gone silent. I moved toward the vending machine near the entrance. The dim light of the rest stop made everything look warped and unnatural. My fingers fumbled in my pocket for change, but then a sound. Soft footsteps on gravel. I turned my head sharply, scanning the lot. No one. The only car here was mine. The rest stop building was dark, its interior lights off. The vending machine's fluorescent glow flickered once, twice. I was alone, or so I thought. My reflection in the vending machine glass was wrong. Behind me, standing several feet away, was a figure. The same man in the suit. But I hadn't heard him approach. My breath hitched in my throat. Slowly, my hands trembling, I turned to face him. He was closer now. His expression was blank, almost inhuman, his lips pressed into a thin, unmoving line. His eyes were wrong. Dark. Hollow. Almost too deep. I took a step back. He didn't move. The air around me grew thick, suffocating. I could feel an unnatural pull, as if I were standing too close to the edge of something deep and endless. Then, he did something that nearly made my heart stop. He smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was slow, deliberate, stretching wider than it should, as if his skin were too tight, as if his face wasn't meant to make that expression. The vending machine flickered again, and in that split second of darkness, he was gone, vanished. The silence was deafening. I stumbled back to my car, fumbling with my keys, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The moment I slammed the door shut, I locked it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely put the key in the ignition. I needed to get out of here. As I peeled out of the parking lot, gravel spitting from my tires, I stole one last glance at the rest stop. And there he was, standing beneath the flickering light, watching. His smile still stretched impossibly wide. I floored it, heart hammering in my chest, the world blurring past me as I tore down the highway. The radio crackled. Static. Then a voice, distorted, distant. Keep driving. The signal cut out. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. It was a small, forgettable place, a single gas station, a cheap motel, and a 24-hour diner glowing under buzzing neon lights. The streets were quiet, empty, like the town had been abandoned years ago, but no one had bothered to tell it. I pulled into the diner's parking lot, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. My hands were still shaking. My heart was still racing. The image of that man, that thing, was burned into my mind. I needed to calm down. I needed to breathe. The diner was nearly empty, save for a lone trucker hunched over a plate of eggs and a waitress wiping down the counter. I took a seat at the far end of the room, my back to the wall. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, approached me with a warm but weary smile. "What can I get you, sweetheart?" "Just coffee," I muttered. She nodded, poured me a cup, then walked away. I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic, trying to ground myself. But even here, surrounded by the smell of stale coffee and frying bacon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The bell above the door jingled. I stiffened. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. I didn't look up. Didn't want to. But my body betrayed me. My eyes flicked toward the entrance. And there he was. The man in the suit. He stepped inside, his presence warping the very air around him. He moved with an unnatural grace, like he was gliding rather than walking. I gripped the coffee cup so hard I thought it would shatter. He didn't look at me. Instead, he walked past my booth, his footsteps eerily silent against the checkered floor. He took a seat at the counter, facing away from me. The waitress didn't react. She didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge him at all. I swallowed hard. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining this. I had to get out. I reached for my wallet, fumbling with the bills, when something caught my eye. A reflection. In the diner's long wall mirror. I turned my head slowly, and my stomach dropped. The man in the suit wasn't in the mirror. His booth was empty, but he was sitting there. I felt a cold dread seep into my bones. That's when he finally turned. Not his body, just his head, twisting too far, too smoothly, like a marionette on loosened strings. His mouth curled into that horrible, unnatural smile. Then, his lips moved. But the sound didn't come from him. It came from my phone. It buzzed on the table, screen lighting up with an unknown caller. I hesitated. Then, against my better judgment, I answered. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, a whisper. A voice identical to mine. "You should have kept driving." The line went dead. I bolted from my seat, nearly knocking over the coffee cup. The waitress turned, startled. "Something wrong, sweetheart?" I opened my mouth to speak, to scream, to tell her there's a man sitting right there who doesn't exist in the mirror. But when I turned back, the booth was empty. The man was gone. A gust of cold air rushed through the diner as if someone had just walked out. The bell above the door swayed gently, but it hadn't rung. I looked around, my breath coming in short gasps. The trucker kept eating. The waitress frowned at me, concerned but oblivious. I grabbed my phone, my keys, and ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, locking the doors, forcing the key into the ignition. My heart pounded against my ribs as I slammed the gas pedal, peeling out of the lot. The road stretched before me once more, dark, endless, watching. My phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. I didn't answer, but a text message popped up on the screen. A photo. My stomach twisted as I opened it. It was a picture of me, sitting in that booth. From behind, like someone had been watching me the whole time. I dropped the phone like it was burning me. And then, in my rearview mirror, a shape. A figure in my back seat. The last thing I saw before my world went black was that awful, inhuman smile. Story 2. The highway stretched before me, an endless black ribbon cutting through the Pennsylvania wilderness. The trees on either side loomed like silent sentinels, their skeletal branches reaching toward the sky. It was past midnight, and the world had settled into an eerie stillness, the kind that makes your skin prickle for no discernible reason. I was heading home after visiting my sister, taking an unfamiliar back road to avoid the highway traffic. My GPS assured me this was the quickest route, but the complete lack of other vehicles made me question whether it was wise. The only sound was the hum of my car's engine and the occasional rattle of the heater struggling against the cold. Then, a soft ding from my dashboard. Low fuel. I sighed, scanning the roadside for any sign of civilization. After a few more miles, a flickering neon sign emerged from the darkness, Apex Gas and Goods. It looked old, almost abandoned, the kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie. I pulled in next to the single functioning gas pump. The air outside was thick with the scent of damp earth and gasoline. There was only one other vehicle here, an old, rusted pickup truck, the kind that looked like it had seen better decades. A man stood beside it, leaning against the pump, watching me. I ignored him, locking my doors before heading inside. The shop was dimly lit, the buzzing fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the narrow aisles. An older man stood behind the counter, barely acknowledging my presence. I grabbed a coffee and paid in cash for my gas, eager to get back on the road. As I walked outside, the man by the truck was still watching me. His face was expressionless, but something about his gaze made my stomach knot. I quickly got into my car and locked the doors again. I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway. But as I glanced in my rearview mirror, I noticed something strange. The pickup truck was still parked there, but the man was gone. I shook off the unease and focused on driving. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless, only my headlights cutting through the thick darkness. The silence was almost suffocating. Then my car gave another warning, tire pressure low. I felt it immediately, a rhythmic thudding, the unmistakable wobble of a flat tire. Cursing under my breath, I pulled to the side of the road. I stepped out into the freezing air, my breath billowing in front of me as I inspected the damage. Rear driver's side tire completely flat. I didn't remember hitting anything. And yet, here I was, stranded on an isolated road with no cell service. I popped the trunk, retrieving my emergency flashlight and spare tire. That's when I heard it. A distant crunch. Footsteps on gravel. I turned, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches creaking, but I saw nothing. Then, a shape, just beyond the tree line. A shadow standing perfectly still, half hidden between the trees. I took a step back, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs. The shadow didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched. I swallowed hard and forced myself to look away, to focus on changing the tire. My fingers trembled as I worked, my pulse hammering in my ears. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. But then came another sound. Not footsteps, not rustling leaves. Something else. Breathing. Slow. Ragged. Close. I whipped around, flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. But there was nothing there. The shadow was gone. Just as I exhaled in relief, something grabbed my ankle. A hand. Ice cold. Fingers too long and too strong. I screamed, kicking wildly, stumbling back into my car. The hand released me, retreating into the darkness. I scrambled into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut and locking it. My breath came in shallow gasps, hands shaking as I turned the key. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, speeding away. The road twisted through the forest, my tires screeching as I took the turns too fast. I just needed to get away. Then, headlights in my mirror. A truck. The old pickup truck. It had been parked at the gas station, and now it was following me, getting closer. I pushed the gas pedal to the floor, but the truck stayed right on my tail. The high beams flashed once, twice, blinding me. Then, the truck veered to the side, pulling up alongside me. The driver's window was down, but I couldn't see his face, just the outline of a figure. Then, a hand shot out from the driver's side window. A hand that wasn't attached to any arm. It hit my windshield with a sickening slap. I screamed as the severed hand crawled across the glass, its fingers bending at unnatural angles, scratching at the surface. I jerked the wheel, nearly losing control as my car skidded onto the shoulder. The truck sped ahead, disappearing into the darkness as suddenly as it had appeared. The hand was gone. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white. I didn't stop driving, didn't look back, but the image stayed with me. The hand gray, lifeless, moving with an intelligence it shouldn't have possessed. And as I continued down the lonely road, one last thought crawled into my mind. That thing in the trees. It hadn't grabbed my ankle. It had let me go, because it knew something worse was coming. I didn't stop. I couldn't. The road twisted and turned through the dense Pennsylvania wilderness, each mile stretching into infinity. My hands were locked onto the wheel, knuckles white, breaths coming in ragged gasps. The severed hand was gone, but the memory of it lingered. Those spindly fingers, the way they had moved, the wet slap as they hit my windshield. The truck had disappeared into the night, swallowed by the endless dark. But I didn't trust that it was truly gone. Something was still out here with me. The fuel gauge ticked lower. My tire pressure warning still flashed on the dashboard. I couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. But then, a light up ahead. A road sign. Stanton Rest Stop 2 miles. Relief flooded me. A place to regroup, to think. I could check my tire, catch my breath, figure out what the hell was happening. I kept driving, watching the trees blur past in the darkness. But then, in the corner of my eye, movement. Not on the road. In the woods. Something running parallel to my car. Something fast. My heart stuttered. I tightened my grip on the wheel, refusing to look, refusing to acknowledge whatever was keeping pace with me in those trees. Faster. It was keeping up. Branches cracked, leaves rustled, but I refused to look. Then, a shape broke through the tree line. A deer. It bolted onto the road, its eyes flashing in my headlights. I swerved, barely missing it. My tires screeched against the pavement, the car skidding wildly before I yanked the wheel back under control. My heart hammered. I glanced in my rearview mirror. The deer was lying in the road. Its legs twitched. A sharp, gasping breath rattled from its body. Then, before I could react, something stepped out of the trees. Not a person, not an animal. Something in between. Tall. Too tall. Its limbs were wrong, bending in places they shouldn't. Its fingers hung too long at its sides, twitching slightly as it moved. It stood over the dying deer, head cocked, as if studying it. Then, it knelt and touched it. The deer convulsed violently, its entire body seizing up. Its legs jerked, mouth stretching wide in a silent scream. And then, it stood up, like a marionette on strings. It turned slowly, unnaturally, toward my car. I slammed the gas pedal. The rest stop appeared like a mirage in the distance. A lone building, dimly lit, standing in the middle of nowhere. The parking lot was empty, save for a single car parked near the entrance. I pulled in, tires screeching, my hands trembling as I killed the engine. My mind was racing, trying to process what I had just seen. I glanced back at the road. The deer and the thing were gone. I exhaled shakily, stepping out into the frigid air. The rest stop looked deserted, the few flickering lights barely illuminating the lot. I hurried inside. The air was stale, thick with the scent of old coffee and bleach. The place was empty, no cashier, no workers. Just rows of vending machines, an old coffee station, and a single bathroom door slightly ajar at the back. I rubbed my temples, trying to calm my breathing. Maybe I was losing it. Maybe the exhaustion was making me hallucinate. A muffled sound. I froze. It came from the bathroom. A low, wet scraping noise. I took a cautious step forward. Another noise, like something shifting, something dragging. I swallowed hard. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my body betrayed me, my feet pulling me forward. The door was slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. I reached out, pushed it open. The lights flickered on, and my stomach dropped. The man from the gas station was inside, but he wasn't standing. He was hanging from the ceiling. His body was suspended in midair, head tilted to the side, mouth slightly open. His arms dangled loosely, his feet inches off the ground. A thin, black substance dripped from his fingers. His eyes opened. I stumbled backward, slamming into the sink. His body twitched. A horrible, wet crack shuddered through the air as his limbs jerked violently. His neck snapped upright. And then, he spoke. But it wasn't his voice. It was mine. You should have stayed in the car. I turned and ran. I burst out of the bathroom, nearly falling as I sprinted toward the exit. My breath came in ragged gasps, my pulse hammering in my ears. The moment I stepped outside, the pickup truck was there, parked beside my car. The driver's side door swung open slowly, creaking loudly in the silence. Someone stepped out. The man in the suit. I froze. His head tilted. That same unnatural smile stretched across his face. But this time, he raised his hand, and in his grip was a severed hand, the same one that had crawled across my windshield. I backed away. My body screamed at me to run, but I was paralyzed. Then, he dropped the hand. It twitched. The fingers curled. And then, it scuttled toward me. I snapped out of my trance, bolting to my car. I fumbled with the keys, throwing myself inside and locking the doors. My breath came in shallow gasps as I turned the ignition. The headlights illuminated the lot. The man in the suit was gone. But in the distance, at the edge of the woods, the thing stood watching. Its limbs twitched, its head tilted, and beside it, the deer stood too, just watching, just waiting. I peeled out of the lot. The road stretched ahead, endless, dark, suffocating. My heart slammed against my ribs as I sped forward, not daring to look back. But I didn't need to, because in my rearview mirror, a pair of hollow black eyes stared back at me, smiling. Story 3. The blizzard hit harder than expected. Thick walls of snow slashed against my windshield, the wipers barely keeping up as I navigated the nearly invisible road. My fingers were stiff around the steering wheel, the heat in my old car struggling against the creeping cold. I was already regretting this trip. Todd, my boyfriend, lived a few states away, and I had made the mistake of thinking I could beat the storm. The forecast had warned of heavy snowfall, but I figured if I left early enough, I'd make it to his place before it got bad. I was wrong. Now, miles from the nearest town, I was trapped in a swirling, endless whiteout. The road beneath me was disappearing fast, my tires sliding unpredictably. If I didn't stop soon, I'd end up in a ditch or worse. Then, as if answering my desperate thoughts, a flickering neon sign appeared ahead. A motel. I squinted through the snow. The place looked old, run down, the kind of motel you'd expect to see in an urban legend. A few cars were parked out front, half buried in fresh snow. But it was shelter, and that was all I cared about. I pulled into the lot, tires crunching over ice. The building was a single-story structure, its motel office marked by a buzzing yellow light. I hurried inside, my boots tracking slush across the linoleum floor. The front desk was cluttered with paperwork, an old bell sitting atop the counter. I rang it. A moment later, a man emerged from the back office. He was tall, gaunt, his face stretched too tight over his cheekbones. His name tag read Eli. He didn't smile. "Storm's bad," he said, voice flat. "Yeah," I exhaled, shivering. "I just need a room for the night." He stared at me for a moment, then slid a key across the counter. "Room 5. Cash only." I frowned. "I don't have cash." Eli's expression didn't change. "ATM's in the corner." I sighed and turned toward the dimly lit ATM near the entrance. As I stepped up to it, I felt the weight of his stare on my back. The machine beeped softly as I inserted my card, the screen flickering before prompting me to enter my PIN. I tapped in the numbers. The screen glitched. Static rippled across it, the numbers distorting. Then, something flashed across the screen. A face. For a split second, I saw my own reflection. But something was wrong. The eyes staring back at me weren't mine. They were too dark, too empty. I stumbled back, heart hammering, as the ATM spat out my card. Eli was still watching. His eyes didn't blink. I forced a smile, grabbed my card and cash, and slid it across the counter. He handed me the key without another word. I hurried out to my car, grabbed my overnight bag, and trudged through the snow to room 5. The room was exactly what I expected, cheap wallpaper peeling at the edges, a bed that looked stiff as cardboard, a small bathroom that smelled faintly of mildew. But it was warm. I locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed, exhaling slowly. The storm howled outside, the wind rattling against the thin walls. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Todd. I answered immediately. "Hey," I breathed, relief flooding me. I had to stop. "The blizzard's too bad." "Where are you?" His voice crackled slightly. "A motel," I said, glancing around. "Middle of nowhere, but at least it's warm." Todd was quiet. Then, "You sure you're alone?" The question sent a shiver down my spine. "What?" "Yeah, why?" His breath hitched. He paused. "Can you check your room number?" I frowned. "It's room 5. Silence. Then, his voice dropped to a whisper. "No, it's not." A sharp knock interrupted the call. I jumped, nearly dropping my phone. The knock came again, slow, deliberate. I turned toward the door, my breath catching. I had locked it, didn't I? Another knock. Louder. I swallowed hard, creeping toward the peephole. I hesitated, then looked, and my stomach plummeted. The hallway was empty. No one was there. The motel door rattled violently. I gasped, stumbling back as the handle jerked. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the room. I grabbed my phone, trying to call Todd back, but my screen flashed no service. The door went silent. I held my breath. Then, a soft creak behind me. From the bathroom. I turned slowly. The bathroom door, which had been closed, was now slightly open, and the light inside was flickering. A shadow moved behind the curtain. I wasn't alone. I couldn't move. The bathroom door creaked open an inch wider, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The overhead light flickered, the bulb buzzing like an angry wasp. My breath hitched as the air inside the motel room shifted. It felt thicker, colder, like the presence of something unseen had just settled in. The shadow behind the curtain shifted. My entire body screamed at me to run, but I didn't. Instead, I took a slow step forward, every nerve in my body tingling with fear. My fingers trembled as I reached out toward the bathroom door, pushing it open just enough to see inside. The light flickered again, then cut out completely. Darkness swallowed the tiny space. I sucked in a sharp breath. My heart was hammering against my ribs as I fumbled against the wall for the light switch. My fingers found it, and I flicked it back on. Nothing. No movement. No shadow behind the curtain. Just my own ragged breathing and the sound of the wind howling outside. Forcing a shaky laugh, I shook my head. I was just exhausted, sleep-deprived and paranoid. That was all. I backed away and shut the bathroom door, this time locking it. I checked my phone. Still no service. Todd's last words echoed in my head. No, it's not. What the hell had he meant? I sank onto the bed, rubbing my temples, trying to shake the lingering unease. Outside, the wind battered the motel, snow slamming against the windows. Then, a whisper. Not from outside. From inside the room. My head snapped up. My breath hitched as my eyes darted around the dim space. The closet door was open. It had been closed before. Something shifted inside. I lurched to my feet, grabbing the motel key from the nightstand. I was getting out of here. But just as I reached for the doorknob, a voice, low and familiar, whispered right behind me. Where are you going? I turned so fast I nearly lost my balance. There was no one there. The closet was empty. The room was empty. But I had heard it, and it had sounded like me. I fumbled with the lock, yanking the door open. The freezing wind hit me like a wall, sending ice-cold air slicing through my clothes. The parking lot was nearly invisible beneath the thick snowfall. But something wasn't right. The motel office was dark. The neon sign that had been buzzing before? Gone. The cars in the parking lot? Gone. Everything was silent, as if the world beyond the motel had been wiped away. I turned back to my room, my pulse thundering in my ears, and froze. The numbers on my door. They weren't 5 anymore. They had changed. Room 0. I staggered back. My breath came in sharp gasps as I whipped my head around. Every door in the motel had the same number. 0, 0, 0, 0. I clutched my phone, trying again for service. The screen glitched, the pixels warping. Then, an incoming call. Unknown number. My hands trembled as I hesitated, then answered. Static. Then, that same whispering voice, but this time, it was distorted, layered, wrong. Don't look back. The call cut off. And then, a soft breath, warm and wet, brushed the back of my neck. I ran. I bolted down the motel walkway, my boots slipping on the ice, my breath ragged in the freezing air. The hallway seemed longer now, stretching into infinity, the doors all marked room 0. I sprinted past them, my legs burning. And then, a figure stepped into my path. I barely had time to stop. My feet skidded, and I almost fell. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered motel uniform. Her face was wrong, pale, hollow-eyed, mouth stitched shut with something black and glistening. She raised a trembling hand and pointed. Behind me. I turned. The man from the front desk stood a few feet away, but his face had changed. His mouth was gone. His eyes were too large, too black. His skin stretched like wax melting under heat. His head tilted as he took a step forward, then another. Then, his jaw split open. A deep, endless black hole gaped where his mouth should have been. A sound, low, guttural, vibrating through the air like distant thunder, rumbled from within him. I stumbled back, crashing into the woman. She was gone. I was alone. The motel had shifted around me, the walls stretching, the floors warping like something was pushing up from beneath them. I ran. I sprinted toward the exit, toward the parking lot. But my car wasn't there. There was no parking lot, no road, no outside. Just a blank expanse of endless white snow, stretching into nothingness. The motel was floating, suspended in a void. And standing in the snow, at the very edge of reality, was myself. A perfect copy of me. She smiled. And then, she whispered, "You should have stayed in your room." Darkness swallowed me whole. And the last thing I heard before I lost consciousness was the door clicking shut behind me.